Welcome to a deep dive today into who we are. It's a memoir by Murray Sinclair,
Yeah.
and you probably know him as the former senator, the judge. He led Canada's Truth and Reconciliation Commission.
Right.
And I think a lot of people might think, oh, another political memoir, but this is different.
It really is.
This isn't just about a life in law and politics. It's really about navigating Indigenous identity in a country that's grappling with its past. And ultimately, I think it's about understanding who we are as Canadians.
Absolutely. And it's written in a way that's so much more than just a typical memoir. It's very accessible.
Yeah.
He takes you on a journey that's deeply personal, but also it's so relevant to understanding just the fabric of Canada. And like you said, it's not just about telling his story. He weaves it into this larger story of Indigenous people and their fight for justice and for recognition.
And he starts with a really powerful question, a set of questions, I should say, that I think all of us kind of wrestle with at some point. Where do I come from? Where am I going?
Yeah.
Why am I here? Who am I?
Big questions.
Big questions. But for Sinclair, these aren't just philosophical, musings.
Right.
These are questions that are directly tied to his Indigenous heritage. He was raised by his grandparents on a reserve, experienced firsthand the realities of poverty, but also the strength and the love of family.
Yes.
And it's really in that family history where we begin to grasp, I think, the weight of those four questions.
Right.
Take, for example, the story of Sinclair's grandmother. She was forced as a young girl in residential school. And for those who don't know, the residential school system was designed to assimilate Indigenous children, strip them of their language, their culture. She was forced to sign a contract promising her grandson Murray Sinclair to the priesthood.
It's unbelievable. It's unbelievable to think about that.
It's a chilling detail, isn't it? Like, this agreement wasn't about her hopes and dreams for her grandson. It was about a system that was trying to control the fate of Indigenous families.
Right.
And yet Sinclair ultimately rejects that path that was laid out for him and chooses to become a lawyer.
Right.
An advocate for Indigenous rights. And I think it speaks volumes about his resilience, about his determination to forge his own path, and to challenge the very system that tried to define him.
Yeah, and you can't ignore the symbolism in that contract. It speaks to the attempted erasure of Indigenous identity, this heartbreaking legacy of colonialism that just reverberates through generations. But even within that, you see strength.
Yeah.
His grandfather built their house on the reserve with almost nothing.
Right.
A testament to the resourcefulness and the resilience of a people determined to persevere.
It's such a stark contrast, isn't it?
It is.
This forced assimilation, the loss of identity that's kind of represented by that contract.
Right.
Juxtaposed against just this unwavering spirit of his grandfather.
Of his grandfather, yeah.
And then we have the story of young Murray receiving this book as a gift, the Book of Knowledge. And he talks about how this book opened his eyes to a wider world.
But as he gets deeper into it, he realizes that it predominantly focuses on the achievements of white people.
Yeah.
So it's subtly reinforcing this narrative of Indigenous inferiority. It's a reminder of how easily bias can be woven into seemingly harmless forms of education.
It's insidious, isn't it, how those messages can seep in?
It is.
And those messages, they continue when Sinclair's family moves from the reserve to Selkirk, where he experiences much more direct forms of racism.
Yeah.
And there's this one interaction he talks about with his grade 2 teacher,
Right.
who also taught his father.
Oh, wow.
And she's trying to pay him what she thinks is a compliment.
Yeah.
And she tells him that he's so much smarter than his father ever was.
Wow. Can you
I can
imagine
imagine the impact of hearing that
as a child, especially?
as a child. And it really highlights the insidious nature of prejudice, often presented with a smile
Right.
and a pat on the head.
Yeah.
But it plants these seeds of doubt,
It does.
subtly reinforcing this idea that Indigenous peoples are somehow less than. It's no wonder that these early experiences would shape his understanding of the systemic inequalities that Indigenous peoples face.
Absolutely. And it's that growing awareness that sets the stage for his journey toward justice. These encounters with racism weren't isolated incidents. They were threads in a much larger tapestry of systemic oppression that he would eventually dedicate his life to unraveling. It's like all those threads he starts to notice as a child, they begin to kind of weave themselves into this much larger picture as he gets older. During his high school years, he's beginning to understand the systematic erasure of Indigenous people in their history.
Hmm.
Not just, these isolated incidents, but this deliberate suppression of their culture and their identity.
Yeah, and this isn't just something he's reading in a textbook either.
Right.
Like, it becomes deeply personal, and he starts actively seeking out knowledge.
Yes.
Learning about his family, the Anishinaabe people, the injustices that they face.
And this thirst for knowledge kind of leads him to journalism and activism. He starts working at the Selkirk Friendship Center.
Yeah.
And he's seeing firsthand the challenges that Indigenous peoples are facing. Poverty, discrimination, the lasting impacts of those residential schools.
Yeah.
The ones his grandmother was forced to attend.
Right.
It's this real turning point. He goes from sort of understanding these issues intellectually to actually confronting them in a very real and immediate way.
And he talks about a specific book that had a profound impact on him during this time, Wabung.
Yes.
Which he refers to as his, awakening.
His awakening, yeah.
It's like everything just kind of crystallized for him.
Right.
Solidified his dedication to Indigenous advocacy.
It's important to remember, too, that this is also a time of pretty intense personal loss for Sinclair.
Yeah.
He's grappling with the death of his mother and his brother. So he's navigating these depths of grief while also, simultaneously confronting these systemic injustices.
It makes you wonder how he found the strength to kind of keep going.
I know.
And even to channel that pain into something so constructive.
Well, and he talks about finding solace in Indigenous teachings during that time.
Yeah.
It highlights the important role of traditional knowledge in these cultural practices, and not just for, coping with grief and trauma,
Right.
but for building resilience and fostering this sense of community.
It's a real testament to the strength of Indigenous cultures.
Yes.
Even in the face of such adversity.
Absolutely.
And it's within this context that Sinclair really embarks on his professional journey. His path from social worker to lawyer is fascinating. He talks about the influence of individuals like Howard Pauley, who really saw his potential and encouraged him to pursue law.
Yeah.
Even his first experience in a courtroom kind of speaks volumes about his ability to, navigate these really challenging situations. Are you talking about the table full of potential murder weapons?
Yes. That story. Imagine that.
I mean, come on.
That's your first foray into the world of law, and you're dealing with a table full of knives.
Yeah.
It's a fantastic anecdote, but I think beyond the humor, it really shows Sinclair's ability to remain calm and collected under pressure.
Yeah.
Which is a quality that would serve him well throughout his career.
Because it wasn't just any legal career.
Exactly.
He chose to represent First Nations communities.
Yes.
He really became this voice for the voiceless, challenging a system that was often stacked against his clients.
And never shying away from calling out injustice.
Right.
Even when it meant confronting his peers.
Yeah.
He has this powerful story about challenging another lawyer in court who implied that he was only appointed a judge because he was Indigenous. And Sinclair's response is brilliant. He just totally calls out the hypocrisy, the ingrained bias within the system.
It takes courage to do that.
Oh, absolutely.
To stand up like that and to challenge the status quo.
Yeah.
Especially in a profession that's, so steeped in tradition and hierarchy.
For sure.
And this brings us to his role in leading the Aboriginal justice inquiry.
Yes.
And this wasn't just another legal inquiry.
No, it wasn't. It was groundbreaking.
It was groundbreaking.
And I think you have to understand the historical context here.
Okay.
This inquiry was launched in response to a series of events that really shook the nation. They exposed this deep mistrust between Indigenous communities and the justice system. Sinclair was tasked with leading this team to investigate these claims of systemic discrimination within the justice system itself.
It was a massive undertaking.
It really was. And it wasn't just about, analyzing legal frameworks and precedents.
Right.
It was about listening to the stories of Indigenous people who had been failed by the very system that was supposed to protect them.
And those stories were really essential to the inquiry's impact.
They were.
The final report, it didn't just, outline the problems.
Right.
It actually proposed really concrete solutions for addressing things like the overrepresentation of Indigenous people in the justice system. And it called for a fundamental shift in how the legal system interacts with Indigenous communities.
Absolutely.
It was really a watershed moment. And it kind of laid the groundwork for, I think, Sinclair's most significant role as the Chief Commissioner of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada. It feels almost impossible to overstate the significance of this.
It is. Just imagine the weight of that responsibility.
Right, okay.
Leading a commission tasked with uncovering and documenting the truth about residential schools.
Right.
This was about giving a voice to generations of survivors who had been silenced for far too long.
And it wasn't just about, uncovering the truth. It was about reconciliation.
Yes.
What does that even mean?
Right.
In a country grappling with such a dark chapter.
Well, and that question was really at the heart of the TRC's mandate.
Yeah.
They traveled across Canada, they held these hearings, listened to the harrowing testimonies of survivors. They created this space for healing and for understanding.
Yeah, it's one thing to, read about residential schools in a history textbook, but to actually hear these firsthand accounts of those who lived through it.
Yes.
The pain, the abuse, the forced separation from families. It's incredibly powerful.
It is.
It's a stark reminder of the human cost of these policies.
And the TRC went beyond just documenting these experiences.
Yeah.
They really wanted to provide a platform for survivors to share their stories on their own terms, to reclaim those narratives, and to contribute to this collective understanding of this really dark chapter.
And I think for so long, Indigenous voices were excluded from the telling of their own history.
Absolutely.
And I think the TRC really worked to rectify that.
They did.
To center those experiences and to acknowledge the truth of their suffering.
It's something that Sinclair reflects on a lot in the book,
Yeah.
this idea of truly listening, bearing witness to these stories as just this crucial step towards healing and reconciliation.
It's a powerful message.
It is.
And it's something that he continued to champion long after the TRC's mandate actually ended. He served in the Canadian Senate.
He did.
All the while advocating for the implementation of the TRC's calls to action.
Yes.
Pushing for meaningful change at the highest levels of government.
Absolutely.
And he doesn't shy away from the challenges.
He doesn't.
He talks about how people always ask him how many of the TRC's recommendations have been implemented.
Right.
And he's honest about it. He says, well, there's been some progress.
Yeah.
But the journey is far from over.
It is.
True reconciliation, as he envisions it, requires, I think, this fundamental shift in how Canada operates.
Yeah.
This genuine commitment to equity and justice for Indigenous peoples.
And that commitment has to go beyond just, government policies and things like that. It has to reach into the daily lives of all Canadians.
Yeah.
That's where the real work begins. Dismantling those subtle biases, educating ourselves and future generations about the truth of our shared history.
And it really struck me that, through it all, the legal battles, the emotional toll of the TRC, he finds this strength and this solace in his family.
Yes.
In passing down these traditions to his children and his grandchildren.
It's beautiful.
There's this wonderful story he tells about how he convinced his granddaughter that he wrote all the Beatles songs.
I love that story. It's so charming, and it just speaks to the importance of those intergenerational connections. Finding that joy and laughter, even amidst the weight of history. And it really does tie back to those 4 central questions that he poses at the beginning of the book.
Right.
By understanding his roots.
Yeah.
By embracing his identity, he found the strength to navigate these immense challenges.
Yeah.
And dedicate his life to creating this more just future for his kids and his grandkids.
And that's ultimately the message of who we are, isn't it?
It is.
It's not just a memoir.
Yeah.
It's a call to action for all Canadians. It's about confronting our past, understanding the legacy of the residential school system,
Yes.
and actively participating in this ongoing journey of reconciliation.
And I think it's a journey that we can all be a part of.
This deep dive into Murray Sinclair's life and work has been really powerful. And I think for anyone listening, Who We Are is a must-read.
I agree. It's a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. And it really gives you a roadmap, I think, for understanding the complexities of Canada's relationship with Indigenous peoples. Pick up a copy. You won't regret it.
It's a book that'll stay with you long after you finish that last page.
At the end of this podcast, please share your thoughts on the book. And if you enjoy this content, don't forget to like and subscribe for more.